Welcome to Pleasurology Island, home of happiness therapy, especially happiness therapy for ex-Christians. I'll be your happiness guru if you want. I'm Free Thought Steve. Well, last time I was talking about ethics, and I want to continue to talk about ethics today. I want to talk about irrational Christian morality as opposed to the rational ethics of pleasurology. All right? Pleasurology is the art of creating euphoric states of consciousness. And as the philosopher G.E. Moore pointed out in the early 1900s, the only things in the whole universe that have intrinsic value are states of consciousness. What does that mean? The only things in the universe that have intrinsic value are states of consciousness. States of consciousness are the only things that ever get experienced. Living organisms like yourself and me, our brains produce a field of consciousness, and that field of consciousness goes through many different types of states of consciousness, and some of those states of consciousness are euphoric, meaning we enjoy them, we like them, we want them to continue, we like to intensify the euphoria. And other states of consciousness are distressing. We call them technically dysphoric instead of euphoric. Eu means good, dys means bad. Euphoric states of consciousness are intrinsically valuable. That is, someone, some consciousness, some organism is actually experiencing that state of consciousness and finding it enjoyable and pleasurable. And it makes them happy to experience that euphoric state of consciousness. So that euphoric state of consciousness has value. And it has value intrinsically, in and of itself. The state of consciousness itself is what has value for us because we're actively experiencing the enjoyment and pleasure of that euphoric state of consciousness. And in contrast, dysphoric, distressing states of consciousness are ones we don't enjoy experiencing and wish to get out of as soon as possible and replace them with a more euphoric state of consciousness. And that's just how we're made. That's how the human brain is made. Because evolution has designed, natural selection has designed our emotional brains to feel euphoria, to feel good feelings when we're doing something that is good for us, like eating or having sex or giving somebody a hug, enjoying sociability with other people, giving someone a massage, or reading a book that's making us smarter or giving us a wider view of the world or simply entertaining us. Our emotional brain has been selected over millions of years to let us feel pleasure and happiness and euphoria when we are doing things that are good for us. And in terms of sex, we are doing something, an activity that may be good for the species in terms of creating new human individuals, and it may be good for us personally in terms of giving us children. So evolution has designed our emotional brain to give us some of the most intense experiences of pleasure and euphoria when we are enjoying our sex drive and satisfying our sex drive. Our sex drive is built into our emotional brain. It's a natural, physiological part of our emotional brain designed by natural selection, once again. Because sexual activity is the way that species get perpetuated, and therefore nobody can be born unless they've had parents who've also had a sex drive. And they've acted on that sex drive, they've enjoyed the pleasure of that sex activity, and it's ended up creating a baby, and we're here. Now, that's not the only way, the only legitimate way to use our natural sex drive, because at some point in human evolution, it was extremely important for us to have as many babies as possible and for us to have a constant high sex drive. The human species has a very high sex drive, so some point in the past, it was very important that humans were very sexy. That was probably about between 60 and 70,000 years ago, when the ancestral population of human beings, our direct ancestors, were limited to about 3,000 couples, which maybe 10,000 people, if you consider them, the 6,000, okay, 6,000 men and women, and then all their children. So the whole human population at that time, maybe 15,000, 20,000 people of the people who became our direct ancestors somewhere in East Africa, probably during the very cold period of history that occurred after the Toba volcano, a mega volcano in Indonesia, blew up and filled the atmosphere with lots of smoke and particles, and blocked out the rays of the sun, so that the temperature dropped enormously, and there were many species that died off at that time, so that may have been when our ancestral human species, our ancestral human population dropped to about 15,000, only 15,000 human beings in the entire world. And today we've got 9 billion, or going up to 9 billion. So that's like a huge, huge increase. So our sex drive obviously worked spectacularly well at repopulating the planet and now overpopulating the planet. And so now we have to be careful not to have more children than we really ought to have, because the world is getting very crowded. And yet we still have a very strong sex drive that makes us want to be sexual basically every day, all year round. Human beings are one of the few species that have a constantly high sex drive, that we're ready and willing and able to have sex year round throughout our entire adult lives. So it's important, it's rational for us, if we don't want to totally overpopulate the world, it's rational for us to find other ways of satisfying our sex drive besides making babies. That we can have as much sex as we want, but we should have only a limited number of children. So our sex drive wants to be satisfied the same way that our hunger drive wants to be satisfied. And if we don't satisfy our sex drive, we become frustrated, and that leads to an unhappy state of consciousness rather than a happy state of consciousness. And when I said that states of consciousness, either euphoric states of consciousness or distressing states of consciousness, are the only things that have intrinsic value, what that is saying is that everything else we value in life is only a means to an end. Those things have value, but they are not intrinsically valuable. They only have value as a means to an end. For instance, money. You got a pile of paper in your hand. It has some value simply from possessing it, because simply from possessing the money, we feel safer, we feel happy that we're going to be able to buy whatever we want to buy, that we really need, and so that our emotional brain is happy about that. And just possessing money creates a euphoric state of consciousness that is valuable to us. We enjoy having money because it makes us feel safe and it lets us know that we're going to be able to get our needs met. And similarly, if we lose money, we feel bad because we're scared that we won't be able to get by. So it's not the money itself. It's not that paper itself. If it was just, some green paper, if it was counterfeit money, green paper, play money, so forth, you couldn't even eat it. It would have no way of producing a euphoric state of consciousness. But if it's real money, then we can go out, for instance, and buy some cannabis gummies down at the cannabis store, if we're lucky enough to live in a state where cannabis is legal, and go buy some cannabis and eat the cannabis, and the cannabis will give us a euphoric state of consciousness, and it's the euphoric state of consciousness that is valuable. It's not the gummies themselves. If they just happen to be ordinary candy, with no psychoactive ingredient, they might give us a little bit of nutrition and they might be tasty to eat, but they wouldn't create the same kind of euphoric state of consciousness that a cannabis gummy would. So we could get a car, for instance, and the car contributes to our euphoric state of consciousness, but it's the euphoric state of consciousness that counts, not so much the car. If it was just a piece of metal that didn't go anywhere, it was just sitting there, it would have, no particular value for us because it wouldn't create a euphoric state of consciousness. But if we can use it to go out on a date with somebody and drive somewhere and then park and make out in the car, maybe, if we want to, the euphoric state of consciousness that the car allows us to have, or if we want to take a drive through the country and see some beautiful scenery, and the scenery itself gives us a euphoric state of consciousness, then the car has been useful as a means to that euphoric state of consciousness. And even finding someone to love is valuable because we feel so good when we're in love. It's the good feeling that we have when we're in love and when we share our life with someone and we feel that we have someone who belongs to us or we belong to them, that we belong to each other. And so we feel like we have a sense of belongingness, a sense of connection. That gives us a feeling of euphoria. It's one of the basic needs that human beings have, to feel connected and to belong. And so when we feel that belongingness, that gives us a state of euphoric consciousness. And it's the consciousness itself that has value for us. If it was just someone that we didn't care about who was there, or if it was just a statue of someone there, and we didn't have that real connection with them, then our emotional brain would not respond by generating the euphoric state of consciousness that has intrinsic value for us. Okay, so that's what G.E. Moore, the philosopher, is a British philosopher in the early 1900s, meant when he said that only states of consciousness have intrinsic value, have ultimate value. Everything else in the world is only a means to an end of getting a euphoric state of consciousness. When Christians pray to God, the act of praying itself, saying the words and so forth and so on, or even thinking the words, the act doesn't create happiness. What creates happiness is imagining that we're talking to God and that God is listening to us and that God is going to therefore protect us. All of that, our emotional brain responds to that imagining by creating a euphoric state of consciousness. So religions are a means to creating euphoric states of consciousness, and that's why people continue to believe in them, even when there's no evidence that they are true. Okay, and so those of us who formerly were religious but who are not religious now used to get feelings of euphoria from praying, or from going to church, from taking communion or taking Mass, from confessing to a priest and getting forgiven. All of these things created euphoric states of consciousness for us. But all of them were based on fantasies about the unknowable. That's why last time I went to such pains to point out that we cannot know actually as truth anything about spiritual beings. Whether can't know if any spiritual beings actually exist because we can't observe them, because they're supposed to be non-physical. And if something's non-physical, we can't observe it with our senses. We can't observe it with any scientific instrument we could ever invent. A non-physical being cannot be observed by definition. So we cannot have any genuine knowledge about such possibly existing beings. We can't know if any of them exist. We can't know if they don't exist. We can't know if they do exist, what they're like. We don't know any of their characteristics. We know nothing about them at all. We can only imagine them. And that's what human beings have been doing for thousands of years. Human beings have been imagining the unknowable in ways that make them feel safer, that make us feel safer and more relaxed. That's the purpose of religion. Religion is a stress reduction device, when it works well. But unfortunately, when you start believing imaginary things, you can make up any new imaginary beliefs and add them onto the old ones. And if you do that and start believing that these imaginary beliefs are true, you can create a crazy, crazy, crazy worldview for yourself. And that's what Christianity has done down through the years. It's become something that creates more stress than it relieves for a lot of people, because it's based on threats of hell, and it's based on the idea of God as an anti-pleasure God, an anti-sexual God, who thinks that we are sinful if we are sexual, and who will send us to hell if we don't believe in that particular God. And that's an imaginary construct that has a very real effect on our emotional brain, and therefore on our state of consciousness, if we believe that that imaginary construct is true. Our only escape from religion is to refuse to believe that any statement about the unknowable is anything more than imagination, and refuse to believe that the imaginary is true. That's our only salvation from religion, is to say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to believe that anything is true unless it's real rather than imaginary. If something's imaginary, if it's something that you cannot show me the truth of, but you only have a book that's written about it, and you're telling me to believe that what the book says about this thing is true, that's just imagination. And the words in that book are not words that came from the unknowable. Those are words of human beings guessing about the unknowable, and then writing down as though they themselves were the unknowable, as though they themselves knew what the unknowable was like. And then they make that false truth claim. Other people believe it, and they teach their children to believe it, and people go on for generation after generation believing a bunch of imaginary truth claims about the unknowable, not one of which can be proven to be true. So what should we believe about the unknowable? We should believe that we know nothing about the unknowable as true. But those of us who were raised to believe that we were being watched by God all the time, And when we were children, we were taught to believe that so much that our brains still have that belief hanging out there that we're being supervised by God. If we decide to stop being Christians, we may feel really scared, because our emotional brain may still believe that there's a God there watching us who will get angry at us for not believing in the true existence of that God. And it's very hard to get that emotional mechanism out of our brains. So one of the best things we can do to counteract that image of a scary God observing us all the time is to replace that with the image of a different kind of God. Go out in the beauty of nature, look at the beauty of nature, and say, all right, this is such a beautiful world. Looking at a beautiful garden, looking at a forest, looking at the ocean or the mountains or a field of wildflowers or whatever it happens to be, looking at this beautiful, beautiful, wonderful planet that we live on, we can say, all right, anyone's guess is as good as another about the unknowable. And when I look at the beauty of nature all around me, my guess is that if there was some intelligent entity that created all of this, that entity is a kind entity, that entity is a loving entity, that entity just wants us all to be as happy as possible. What we can say to ourselves, and this is just imagining the unknowable, yes, we're doing a counter-imagining of the unknowable, all right? As opposed to the way we were taught to imagine the unknowable by Christianity, that scary kind of way of imagining the unknowable that makes us feel anxious, particularly when we've stopped believing in it. We can say, okay, I prefer to believe that if there are unknowable entities, intelligent entities that are responsible for the universe, that they're kind and benevolent, and that what they really want is for all of us whose lives have grown out of this planet and are flourishing now on the surface of this planet, they want us all to just enjoy our lives by having the most euphoric states of consciousness that we can possibly have while we're alive. And as I said last time, when we die, we're not going to remember anything. When we die, this bubble of consciousness simply will evaporate. We won't remember that we ever lived. We won't regret not living anymore. And that state of affairs will go on for no time at all, because without consciousness, we can't experience time. So we're in a consciousness which has a finite duration. Yes, it will end at some point, and our consciousness will just simply evaporate. Nothing will happen to us after that, and nothing will happen to us for no time at all. And if for some reason we wake up in another organism 100 billion years from now, that next consciousness would begin immediately after our previous human consciousness had ended. There would be no time in between the two, because without consciousness, it's impossible to experience the passage of time. So when one consciousness ended, another consciousness would begin immediately. Only the next consciousness would have no memory of the previous consciousness, because there's no way to transfer memories from one organism to another. We don't have a soul. See, that's what Christianity is built on. This is another imaginary construct of Christianity, the idea that consciousness can leave a living organism, leave its brain, and when the brain dies and the body dies, the consciousness can just float off into space all on its own and remain conscious of everything, and then eventually, go to heaven or go to hell and experience the stuff. Having conscious experience without a brain and a body, that's an imaginary construct of Christianity. All the evidence we have is that as soon as our brain stops generating consciousness, consciousness disappears. And that happens to us every night during dreamless sleep. And we have no memories of what goes on during dreamless sleep, even though it may last 20 minutes, 40 minutes or so. We have no memory of it at all, because as soon as our brain stops producing consciousness, there's no experience, and there's no passage of time. And so if we go in and have an operation, we go into under anesthesia, we lose consciousness, and then we immediately regain consciousness, and it's an hour or two later, and the surgery is over, and and it seemed like the moment that we went under the anesthesia, we came out of the anesthesia immediately. All the evidence points to the fact that when the brain is not generating consciousness, consciousness just isn't there. So that consciousness is a field of conscious awareness which is being created by our brain at every instant. The brain is having to recreate our consciousness every moment that we're living. And if our brain is deprived of oxygen for even 2 or 3 seconds, kaboom, our consciousness just evaporates. It's what they call blacking out. It just evaporates. It cannot persist without the brain actively generating consciousness using the consciousness circuitry. Now, what does this have to do with ethics? Okay, when we imagine a benevolent, kindly God, everything we imagine affects our emotional brain. And our emotional brain, if it believes, if we are visualizing a benevolent God in the universe, our emotional brain will calm down. Some people, that isn't true. Some people get anxious imagining even a benevolent God. They say, why do we have to imagine any God at all? And they're more calm and relaxed if they don't imagine any God at all. Okay? And that's fine. All right? But the main thing is we need to get actually truly relaxed. And it doesn't matter if we imagine, if we relax ourselves by imagining a benevolent God, even though we can't prove that there is one. All we're saying is that if there is any unknowable spiritual entity, I'm assuming that it's benevolent. There's no reason for me to assume that it's malevolent or angry. I'm assuming that it is benevolent, kindly, and that it will go on loving me, whether I believe that it exists or not. A truly loving God will love us all, whether we believe that God exists or not. And on the other hand, we may be in a universe with no unknowable spiritual entities whatsoever. We may be in a universe that's just purely physical matter and energy and consciousness energy, and everything is operating simply according to natural laws. And if that's the case, then what we have to do is simply pay attention to the world, because the world is going to act in a natural, lawful way, and we can learn how to navigate the world intelligently if we pay attention. Paying attention to the world is really, really important. Because paying attention to reality is what counts. And that's one of the problems with Christianity, is that people get so focused on the unreal, on the imaginary, that they can't connect with reality. And that was one of the benefits of psychedelics for me, was that LSD cleared away my thought cloud and allowed me to see the world very clearly and see how beautiful the world was. And it also gave me a feeling of calmness. LSD doesn't work the same on everyone because everybody's brain is different. But for me, every time I've taken LSD, it has thoroughly calmed down my emotional brain to the point where I feel like everything is fine. There's absolutely nothing for me to worry about. And that's a great feeling to have, It's a wonderful feeling to have. And, even if I die, that's not anything to worry about. Death is delightful. Death is bliss. Death is twice as nice as this. Being alive takes energy and stress, all the time, effort to stay alive and remain happy and relaxed and enjoy our lives. That all takes effort, So death is a release from all effort, and death is a release from all distress. It's impossible for us to have died and to be sitting around saying, gosh, I'm sorry I'm not alive anymore. I wish I were alive again, but I'm never going to be alive again. That's just too bad. No, it's impossible for us to sit around and think that after we're dead, because without consciousness, you don't even know that you're not there. And you can't, and without an emotional brain, you can't regret anything whatsoever. So the loss of consciousness is liberation from the effort that life is. And the Buddha said, all life is suffering, All life is some kind of discontent, he said. And we're always craving something that will ease our discontent. And so life is work, and his remedy was, well, just don't care about anything. Just don't be attached to anything, and don't care about anything, and live your life without caring about anything, and be non-attached about it, and that way you can stay calm your entire life, which is okay. It's certainly good to know how to be non-attached, to say, okay, if this doesn't work out, that's fine. I can do without whatever it is that I think I'm going to get from that, and I'll find something else that will help me be happy. I will find another way to get my needs met. And that way you don't pressure people and say, oh, you've got to do this for me, you got to do this for me, because I'm going to die if you don't. That's ultimate attachment. There are times when we're in dire straits and we need to get something very badly, and then it's important to be attached about that. But most of the time as we go through our life, we can do without the things we think we want or need. And if we learn to just let go of that stuff and not be attached to it, our relationships with other people will be much better, because we won't be trying to pressure them into doing something they don't want to do. That's what attachment is when you say, oh no, you got to do this for me, even if you don't want to, because it's so important to me. Well, that is not the best way to get people to do stuff, usually. The best way to get people to do stuff is say, you know what, I really would like this to happen. It would be wonderful for me if this would happen, and I hope that you can help me make this happen. But, can you or not? And leave them the freedom to say yes or say no. But just because as soon as you start coming on to somebody with this energy, like, oh, you've got to do this for me, they tend to get defensive, and they say, no, don't, fuck you. Don't try and push me into doing something that I don't want to do. They get defensive. But they're more likely to say no. But if you just approach them calmly and with the whole attitude like, you don't have to say yes to this. It won't bother me if you say no. I'm just telling you, what I need, and I think you could help me make that happen if you wanted to. And just putting it out to them. But but not making them feel like you're going to get angry at them if they don't do it. Okay. So believing in a benevolent God, whether a benevolent God exists or not, but believing that if there is a benevolent God, then we have nothing to worry about. That benevolent God will be helping us through our life, at every turn, just because that benevolent God is benevolent. And it might be a benevolent goddess. It might be a whole pantheon of benevolent gods or spirits. We don't know. But let's assume, if we assume that if there do happen to be spiritual entities, that they are purely benevolent and that they approve of us, as long as what we're doing is we're trying to create happiness. We're trying to create euphoric states of consciousness for ourselves, but also for the people around us. And as long as we are trying to do that, creating happy, pleasurable states of consciousness for ourselves and or for other people, then we assume that if there are benevolent spiritual entities, then they are approving of our activities, they are approving of us as a human being. And this is really why we need ethics to begin with. Some people will say, well, I don't need ethics. I don't need to know, what's right or wrong. But the fact is that if we're at all healthy, we all have a conscience. And we all have feelings of self-worth or feelings of lack of self-worth. And when we do something that our conscience approves of, then our emotional brain generates positive feelings of self-worth within ourselves. And particularly if we do something that our conscience approves of and that other people see and they approve of it too, then we get even more euphoric feelings. Our emotional brain feels even better. But we don't need to have the approval of others if we have our own approval. But do we have our own approval? Does our conscience allow us to feel good, for instance, when we're enjoying sexual pleasure, either by ourselves or with a partner? Does our conscience believe that that's a good thing to do? Because only if our conscience truly believes that creating sexual pleasure and creating states of euphoria are positive things to do and the right thing to do, that the right thing to do is for all of us to be as happy as possible in our lives, including sexual happiness. If our conscience truly believes that, then our emotional brain will give us feelings of positive self-worth, and we will be happy with ourselves. But it's important that we have a conscience with rational ethical values. If we were raised as Christians, we were taught to have Christian moral values, and those values were generally anti-sexual. And so our conscience may have learned, our conscience was very thoroughly taught to make us feel bad about ourselves if we were enjoying sexual pleasure, either by ourselves or with a partner. Or even thinking about, imagining having sexual pleasure. Some forms of Christian religion are so crazy that they condemn even sexual fantasies and condemn us, particularly if we're enjoying those sexual fantasies. The standard thing that I've read in Christian textbooks on sex is or the online discussions, forums, and whatnot. The standard thing that I've heard is we can't help seeing someone and feeling desire for them. So we shouldn't beat ourselves up if we find ourselves becoming attracted to someone. But if we allow ourselves, if we enjoy fantasizing about engaging with that person sexually, that's what's bad. That's sinful. And the reason for that is that Christianity is founded on this imaginary fantasy that you invite Jesus into your heart, and then the Holy Spirit comes into you and fills your whole body, and then your body has become a temple to Jesus and God, and that if you have sexual pleasure, that is defiling this temple of God. So you no longer belong to yourself in that case. You see, a true, deeply faithful Christian doesn't belong to themselves. They say, no, I don't belong to myself. I belong to God. And Paul, in his letters, calls himself literally the slave of our master, our Kyrion, our dominator, Jesus, the master of the slaves, the owner of the slaves. Jesus is the owner of the slaves because Jesus died on the cross, and that paid for our sins, and therefore our lives no longer belong to us, they belong to Jesus. And if we don't accept that bargain, then we're going to go to hell instead of going to heaven. Okay? And all of this is based on fantasy, based on imagining that Jesus didn't just die and eventually, his body deteriorated back in Judea, and that was the end of Jesus. It's based on the fantasy that Jesus, he didn't. After he died, he actually came back to life, and then he went to heaven, and he's with God up in heaven. And those are imaginary beings, imaginary spiritual beings, Jesus and God, and the Holy Spirit, for which there is no evidence at all of their existence. They are, once again, one of these imaginings about the unknowable that has no truth value whatsoever. Those are false truth claims because they have no evidence whatsoever that they're true. They are the products of the imaginations of people living 2,000 years ago, who died 2,000 years ago, and it's only because they wrote down their imaginings in manuscripts which were preserved that we have been taught that their imaginings, the imaginings of those people who died thousands of years ago, are actually true, that we must believe them, or that we're going to have a terrible afterlife. And the afterlife is another one of those imaginary things that the whole Christian worldview is based on. An imaginary afterlife, an imaginary supernatural beings, and an imaginary hero who died and then came back to life and went to heaven. But if we've been taught that, and taught to believe that, and if we have actually believed it up until we're young adults, let's say, our conscience has been formed by that. And so what we have is a conscience that has been miseducated by irrational values. Rational values are valuing enjoyment, happiness, and pleasure, and trying to intelligently avoid unhappiness, distress, and unpleasure. And that we go through our life, living our life, trying to create the most euphoric states of consciousness that we possibly can each moment as we go through life for ourselves and the people around us. That's a rational conscience. So a rational conscience will approve of whenever we do something that gives us pleasure and satisfaction, that satisfies our needs, satisfies our sexual needs, without creating annoyance or harm or injury to ourselves or anyone else. If we do this intelligently, if we enjoy our pleasure intelligently. And that's what pleasurology is. Pleasurology is the intelligent creation of pleasure, of euphoric states for ourselves and other people. So a rational conscience would have that set of beliefs instead of believing that whatever it says in the Bible is how we should behave. Because whenever we let the Bible dictate what we're doing, we're not actually letting the imaginary being God dictate what we're doing, because nobody knows anything about the imaginary being God. He's part of the unknowable. What we're doing is letting people who've been dead for thousands of years that happen to write this book or these various books that are collected in the Bible, we're letting those dead people tell us how to live our lives 2,000 years later in modern civilization, where we have birth control, where we have medicines, where we have scientific knowledge about things, and where we can, if we choose to, enjoy our sex drives and satisfy our sex drives every day in a very pleasant and positive way that gives us lots of satisfaction if we do it intelligently, And if we do that, then our conscience has no reason to feel bad. Our conscience has a reason to feel good, because we have done what life is for. Life is for creating euphoric states of consciousness, and sexually euphoric states of consciousness are one type of euphoric state of consciousness, and they are a great type and they are some of the most pleasurable states of consciousness we can possibly experience, especially once we learn how to have super euphoric sex. And that's what happiness therapy, happiness relaxation therapy is about, because body-mind relaxation is the foundation of superior states of euphoria, including super euphoric sex. And I know this because I personally have gone through the experience of going from someone who was tense and anxious and not relaxed at all to someone who was relaxed, who was calm, and then learned how to have super euphoric sex. Just relaxing alone will increase your sexual pleasure. But then if you also add on these super euphoric sex techniques that were developed in India and China and were practiced for thousands of years there, then you will have the kind of incredibly euphoric experiences, full brain orgasms, full brain sexual bliss in high arousal before orgasms for extended periods of time, and then having an orgasm that is more powerful than you can imagine, that just flows through your body, one wave of pleasure after another. The orgasms don't last longer than an ordinary orgasm, but the amount of pleasure that we experience in our consciousness is catastrophically more. It's wonderfully more. It's like the whole universe is having an orgasm. And, I'm not bullshitting you about that, because I don't bullshit, all right? I am the son of a Christian minister. And one of the things that was ingrained into me was to not lie, to be honest, and to only tell people the truth. And I do not lie about anything significant. I will tell little white lies when it makes other people feel better for me to do that, or, when it's not a big deal. But on serious things like this, I would never, ever waste your time or mine by lying to you about it. So super euphoric sex is a genuine possibility, and I will be teaching you all the relaxation techniques that you need to know. They're enhanced if you use cannabis. They will help relax your body and your emotions much faster. Why do we need this relaxation? We need this relaxation because most of us especially if we were raised in a Christian environment, we have had constant tension in our lives for years at a time, trying to be impossibly good and impossibly perfect, trying to deny our sex drive, fighting our sex drive, fighting our sexual urges, feeling sinful and any time we did something that wasn't just perfect and right, and being anxious that we will go to hell if we haven't been good enough. All of these things have taught our emotional brain a habit of being anxious and tense. And that habit persists even after we quit believing in Christianity, because it has been built into our body, built into our emotional brain, built into our consciousness, and it has become a habit for us to be tense and anxious. And that habit does not disappear when our intellectual brain says, okay, I'm not going to believe in Christianity anymore because it's just a bunch of crap. It's just pseudo false claims. It's bullshit. And our intellectual brain can say that, but saying that does not remove the chronic tension that's in our muscles, in what's known as our autonomic nervous system that controls our heart rate and our anxiety, and in our hormone system that creates stress hormones, and in the mood system of consciousness that creates an anxious mood. All of those habits that they all start with the emotional brain, and they broadcast out. The emotional brain broadcasts anxiety throughout our body, and the anxiety makes us tense. And that tension does not go away by itself. So we have to spend a lot of time, especially if we are sensitive to anxiety, sensitive to stress, which I certainly was, very, very sensitive to stress. So that's why it was so important for me to spend many years. I've spent my entire life practicing relaxation and getting more and more relaxed as the years go by. But it took, several years. Right at the beginning, almost immediately. It takes about 2 months maybe to really start feeling the effects of doing the relaxation exercises. And then, you really start to feel so good emotionally from doing these exercises, muscle relaxing exercises, breathing exercises, gentle meditation, attention focusing exercises, and emotional flow through exercises to release our pent up toxic emotions like anger and fear and sadness, letting all those flow out of us instead of keeping them inside us. Emotional catharsis is a very important part of the program. And so if you go through the whole thing, it doesn't take long. I learned how to have super euphoric sex 3 years after I started doing my relaxation work. I don't think it would have taken me that long to learn how to do it. It's just that I never tried to do it before because I hadn't read a book that told me how. And then once I did, I tried it, I was successful at it immediately and started having these unbelievable sexual experiences. And so I had been practicing relaxation from the time I was like 24 till I was 27. And that's when I learned to have super euphoric sex. But I'll tell you more about that in future videos. Thanks for listening. I appreciate you letting me talk to you, and I'll try to help you have the euphoric states of consciousness that as a human being you have a right to and you very richly deserve. Thanks for listening. Talk to you again soon.